There is a sense, I think people in Britain are waking up to the fact that we have a failed state in this country. They're waking up to that. Previously, they've said we've just got the most useless bunch of idle politicians in the world. Let's throw them out and get a new lot in. They're now discovering that every time they do that, things aren't getting any better. So it is a fundamental problem with the state. I've experienced it at the top level in government. I've experienced a metaphorical gun being put to my head.
Hi, Liz.
Hi.
Welcome. Thank you for agreeing to do this.
That's okay.
I've read your book. I consider myself a small C Conservative. I've only ever voted Conservative Party, but I haven't voted in the last 3 elections because I felt like the party kind of lost its way. And then I listened to your book, and everything you spoke about, I think, is what Conservative people are demanding. And so I'm sat here hugely disappointed you're not in government, not able to do the things you said.
Well, I'm disappointed too.
And I look at what's happening right, we've got a very serious rape gang crisis at the moment, a scandal that's being spoken about in every quarter. And I feel like a lot of that is a result of the things that you recognise, the failings in government and in the institutions we have. Am I wrong?
You're absolutely right. You're right. And the grooming gang issue, when it first, because there was a documentary, I think, that was put out called Free Girls, and I watched that and I thought, this is absolutely horrific. But it felt at the time like this was being addressed and it was being dealt with. And then a few years down the line, it turns out it wasn't. And it's still going on. It's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary failure of the state.
But how? How does this happen? I mean, I'm from the outside. I feel like we're starting to see behind the veil here. I mean, your book, one of the things that stands out to me is that when you're outside of government, you seem to be able to speak a bit more freely. Is that another fair observation?
That is true. And there are various reasons you can't speak freely when you're in government. One is collective responsibility. So the idea is that all the policies are agreed, and if you're a minister, you can only go along with the line. And I was a minister from 2012 through to 2022, so I had 10 years of a murder. But the other thing is, and this is what I particularly found as Prime Minister, because speaking out about what the Bank of England were doing would have actually made the crisis worse. You were in a very, very difficult position. Do you call out what's wrong with the system with a risk of the whole thing collapsing and Britain being in a debt crisis, or do you try and fix it? And that is the dilemma I think many politicians face. But it's what a lot of people say to me. They say things like, well, you were Prime Minister, couldn't you fix that? And there is a real lack of understanding about the actual powers a Prime Minister has and what those powers are dependent on and how the system actually works now compared to how it worked 30, 40 years ago. Because huge swathes of power have been outsourced. Yeah, I talked about the Bank of England. I mean, you were talking about the grooming gang, the rape gang scandal, but power has been outsourced to the judiciary. It's no longer the case that a politician appoints the senior judges. They're appointed by unelected bureaucrats. So we have lost the levers to actually make the change to our country, which is why things are getting worse, in my opinion.
So does that mean we don't really truly have a democracy? Because if we're voting for a Conservative Party and giving them a mandate, but they don't have the power to execute that mandate because of the civil service.
Well, the thing, in 2010, let's say the Conservatives have won an overall majority. David Cameron could have repealed all of those laws with a Conservative majority, with Conservative MPs who agreed with him with backbone. If he'd said, I'm going to repeal the Human Rights Act, I'm going to repeal the Constitutional Reform Act, which is the act where the judges became unaccountable, he could have said, I'm going to do all that. But he didn't. We didn't get an overall majority. We had to do a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. And also, a lot of Conservative MPs didn't want to take on the status quo. So I think there's only a very short moment when a government is first elected that you can do the type of change our country needs. And we missed the opportunity. We missed the opportunity. And what happened for 14 years is the cracks were papered over.
Was there a demand under Cameron to make those changes internally?
Well, there was some demands by some people. So I was very critical of the amount of quangos that had been set up. I was critical of the powers the Bank of England had. When I became Lord Chancellor, I saw the fact that the powers had been removed and that the judiciary were unaccountable. So there were bits of pressure, but I think it's very hard once a party is in government and dealing with all the day-to-day stuff that you end up dealing with. And, look at the media now. We've now got 24-hour media, we've got social media. There's so much to respond to that those big strategic changes are very, very hard to deliver once the car's already, on the motorway. It's really hard to deliver that stuff.
And so the powers you didn't have, you just mentioned a moment ago that people don't really understand the powers you have and you don't have. How would you articulate that to us as a voter and what needs to change?
What has happened is that the bureaucracy has become increasingly powerful, and the political leadership often gets the blame for things that they can't control. And what needs to happen is Parliament needs to be the organisation that makes decisions in this country because it is elected. And the powers need to be returned to Parliament. That is what needs to happen. And then, if people don't like what that Parliament does, they can vote them out. Right. Because you can't vote out, the chief of police. You can't vote out the governor of the Bank of England. You can't vote out the senior judiciary. So you need people to be accountable to Parliament because those people can be voted out.
So a bit like the US, when Trump comes into power, he will be able to, in the transition of power, put his appointees into the Fed and the SEC.
Although in the US, they often critique how organisations like the Federal Reserve have become too powerful, how the bureaucracy in the US has become too powerful. We've had the Department of Justice has been weaponized and has become overtly political. So they have a similar problem with overpowerful bureaucrats in the States. And this is why Trump talks about the deep state. He talks about draining the swamp. That is exactly what they're facing in the US too. We've just got it 20 times worse in Britain.
So we have
if you think they're bad, if we think that the swamp is deep in America, it's even deeper in here.
So we have our own deep state.
Yes.
And
and we have our own swamp.
And is that
which we call the Blob?
Well, yeah, I've heard Dominic Cummings talk about that. So I think of the deep state as a mysterious group of people controlling power. I just think of our problem in the UK as just a large bureaucratic administrative state. I don't think of it as some kind of like evil secret powers, but am I wrong?
Let's take the grooming scandal and what has happened, or what we know so far. We know that local councillors with political power deliberately covered up and aided and abetted what happened. We know that the police, for various reasons, some of which were political correctness, not wanting to seem as racist, did not prosecute these crimes. We know that there is an ideology of Islamism which has become more powerful in British politics. We've seen at the last election 4 Islamist MPs were elected. We know that ideology is influencing the Labour Party because they do not want to lose votes to the election. So we've got a combination of all those different things happening, which creates a groupthink and creates a blindness to what's going on. Or you could say it's worse than blindness. You could say it's deliberate neglect. And the ideology of Islamism, the ideology of, net zeroism or, climate change extremism, it wasn't a surprise that Greta Thunberg went from being an extremist on climate change or climate crisis, as she would call it, to being an extremist on Israel. So there is an ideology here that has become more dominant, not just in the British government, also in organisations like the BBC, who were found recently at publishing huge numbers of articles that were anti-Israel, being very, very biased. So it's not just these people are incompetent and unaccountable. There is often an agenda that they go into these positions holding.
Where does that agenda come from?
Well, it comes from wherever, any political agenda comes from. It comes from, I think universities have become places where there's groupthink on particular issues where you're unable to speak out if you're, gender critical or whatever, you're not able to voice your full opinions. I think that has become a part of being part of the left-wing elite. And those people have become more powerful in government positions, even in senior corporate positions, but also in the media. And this is why the ideology is linked to which things people decide to pursue, what they believe, what they report. I mean, the Black Lives Matter riots and the George Floyd, the George Floyd incident was reported far more in the British press than the grooming scandals here. I mean, so it creates an environment that isn't a true reflection of what's actually happening in our country.
But do you think it's just organic? It's this organic slide to the left?
I think the bigger the government gets, generally speaking, the more to the left it moves. And there's a thing called Sullivan's law.
Yeah, you talked about it in the
unless
book.
an organisation's explicitly right-wing, it becomes left-wing over time. And you can see that because people working in government are completely insulated from the facts of life. Like, if you don't sell a product that people want to buy, you go out of business. They're insulated from that. They can keep producing terrible products and they don't go out of business because they've always got a job. So they're insulated from the facts of life, which is what makes it easier to be left-wing if you're in a public sector organisation or where you work for the BBC, because you get the BBC poll tax anyway, regardless of how much people want to watch your content.
Well, that's that point I keep raising on my show, is that I did the research on the Labour front bench. Not a single person has ever run a business and doesn't understand the consequences of the budget they've put in place. Yeah, I have 4 businesses. I have to deal with the consequences of the budget. The consequences of Conservative budgets first, and now Labour budgets. And I had, I think I had Steve Baker in here. We talked quite extensively about, he explained there's a serious lack of understanding of basic economics within government, which for someone like me as a voter is terrifying.
There's a lack of economic understanding, but there are also ideologically left-wing economists who, regardless of the facts about which economic policies have succeeded, we know that the supply side policies of Reagan and Thatcher succeeded. We know that the current policies of spending vast amounts of public money don't work. Nevertheless, there are still economists that will say the opposite. So
why though? It's madness.
Well, it is madness. But look at the reaction to Reeves's budget, which was welcomed by the Bank of England, which is full of economists. It was welcomed by the Office of Budget Responsibility. They thought it would deliver more economic growth than it turns out it has. So there's also been, in the economic sphere, there has been a capture of economics departments by the left, by the sort of Thomas Piketty's, thought of this world. So, but it's also true that people have not wanted to engage in economics, and they thought that after Britain turned its economy around, they didn't need to worry about economics anymore, that the money was going to keep coming. If you remember, David Cameron talked about sharing the proceeds of growth as though growth was a given, and all we had to do is worry about sharing the proceeds of it. Not that growth only happens if you actually enable businesses to succeed.
I do want to come back to this. I don't want to leave behind some of the points on the rape gang scandal, because you raise an interesting point. You said there's been cover-ups. Is that criminal, and should that be prosecuted?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm
pretty sure it is. I mean, I can't, prejudge any court cases, of course, but people have not been honest about what is actually going on in our society, and those people are in positions of responsibility. I also believe there's been corruption. If we look at what's happened with the involvement of local councils, the involvement of police authorities, I don't know quite how high it goes up, but it's very worrying that Keir Starmer is refusing to have a full public inquiry.
Well, it's
and this
a right-wing
is the man
conspiracy.
who was in charge of the CPS. Well, I mean, it is outrageous that he is saying this is far right. It's outrageous.
Yeah. And for people listening, it was about 3 hours ago. He claimed that it was a far right conspiracy. I was trying to explain it to my son earlier. We keep having failings with the police, massive failings. I was trying to explain to him what happened with Stephen Lawrence years ago when I was his age. We had a few years ago the murder of Sarah Everard. We've now had this. I mean, it's a constant, complete failures from the police. And I wonder, is that from the issues that you've identified where people have been worried about offending people, or has this come from a funding issue? Are the police underfunded? Where's this come from?
It's not a funding issue.
No.
Because we can see the police are going to Alison Pearson's house at the weekend to look at her Twitter account.
Yeah.
That is obviously misprioritization and a completely wrong sense of what are serious issues that need to be investigated, and what is I believe in freedom of speech. It's outrageous that they called her at her house at a weekend. It does come back to this issue of accountability, that if you want to get on in the public sector, and I saw this for the 10 years that I worked in government, you have to toe the line, not question the orthodoxy, and then if nothing goes wrong on your watch, you will get promoted. So there's an incentive to not admit how bad things are, not admit to what's going wrong, in order to move up the ladder. And if you look at people like Maggie Oliver, who did so much to expose the grooming gangs, she's not in the police anymore. But the people that are at the top of the police tend to be the ones who haven't spoken out, who haven't asked too many questions, who haven't taken difficult decisions. And that is true in the public sector overall. And it's why there is a lack of leadership in the public sector. I could say the same in politics as well. People who speak out in politics, who try to do things, tend to get more criticism than people who don't. And how do you change that? You've got to make it easier to hire and fire these people. You've got to make it easier to hire and fire them. It's as simple as that.
Well, then
the Home Secretary has to be accountable for the performance of the police. And if it's not good enough, she needs to go, or she needs to be able to fire the people that have failed straight away. And at present, it's all clouded in. They'll use the excuse the police are operationally independent, politicians can't interfere. they will use all kinds of HR contractual issues to stop that happening. But I don't think we will get a properly performing public sector until you have real, genuine accountability.
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. But imagine if instead we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines the world's most responsible currency the right way. Because the future depends on it.
But who can bring that accountability? If we don't have strong leadership at the top of politics, how's that ever going to change?
Well, the first thing is that, I have no hope for this government. If I haven't been clear enough about that already, but I have no hope that Keir Starmer is going to transform into a great leader. I think it's impossible. I think he represents the failed consensus of the last 30 years. He comes from the public services who failed to perform. He's the former head of public prosecutions. Rachel Reeves is a former, she worked at the Bank of England. We don't know if she was an economist, but the point is they are wedded and embedded in the system we have, and we have a system problem. So I think the only way of achieving real change is for somebody to get elected on the platform of changing the system. Well, they have to get elected on that. They have to say, we're not going to carry on with the so-called impartial civil service, the so-called independent bodies. I looked this morning how many so-called independent bodies we have in Britain. 444 different public bodies who aren't accountable to anybody, from the Environment Agency to the Migration Advisory Council to the Climate Change Committee, all making decisions about our lives, none of whom we can get rid of. We need a political leader who's prepared to get elected on a ticket of changing all of that, and who has the people ready to do those jobs. That's the only way, in my opinion, because I watched for 14 years of Conservative government. We were already travelling down the road. It was very hard at that point to say we're going to change the whole system.
So do you think it required a shift from Conservatives to Labour to shift back to somebody to have that platform?
I don't see what you mean by that.
So what I mean is, did we have to move away from? Because I think of the Conservative Party the last 14 years generally. I think it's very difficult to judge your time because it was too short. We didn't actually get to see you be a prime minister. I agreed with a lot of your economic policies, by the way, but we didn't probably get to see it. We mainly had Cameron, Theresa May, and Rishi. I don't think of that as a Conservative government myself. From what I think of conservatism, I don't see a striking difference between the 14 years of Conservatives that we had. Sorry, I missed Boris Johnson and Tony Blair's Labour Party. I don't see a significant difference.
It wasn't different enough. It was a different flavour of the same drink.
Exactly. And did the Conservatives need to lose? Do they need to see a disastrous Labour Party for someone to come in and offer significant change? And the reason I say that is that at the moment, that significant change is at least being seen with Reform. Whatever you think of that party, there are strong Conservatives who believe that Reform are at least speaking the language that Conservative voters want.
I mean, what I'm trying to say here is everybody's obsessed in Britain with political gossip. And parties and leaders and who's in and who's out and who's stabbed everybody in the back. And it is important, in order to get the change we need in our country, to elect a good leader and a good party. But that is not enough. That is only the tip of the iceberg. The the people actually running the country at the moment, the bureaucracy, need to change and need to be changed. And that, so my point is, even if you had an utter genius as Prime Minister who was wise in every possible way with a brilliant cabinet, they're not going to be able to deliver with the current system we have. The whole thing needs to be ripped up.
By the way,
it's in a serious state, and I think that what's happened in the last 6 months under Labour has just exposed how bad, how rotten it is.
Sure, I disagree with you slightly when you say that people only care about political gossip. I think there's a lot of people who care about policy. Actually,
when you say people,
what
I'm talking about is the media and the mainstream media mainly. So, for example, today, new details have come out about what the Grooming Gangs did from the court reports, which are absolutely horrific. And yet, what was the second item on the BBC News? Item 1 was the storms, fair enough. Item 2 was Elon Musk's attack on Nigel Farage. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not saying that is what the people of Britain want to hear about or think about, but that is what the sort of 24-hour media cycle's obsessed with.
Sure. I mean, I think that Elon Musk one was kind of interesting because I think a lot of us found that a bit wild and kind of funny that their relationship collapsed so quickly. But I think generally speaking, I think we're in the death throes of the mainstream media anyway, in that you've come here.
You say that, but 68% of people, their main source of news is the BBC in Britain.
But is that declining?
I'd love us to be in the death throes. I would love it more than anyone. But
what's the trajectory of that? Is that declining?
It's definitely declining.
Yeah.
But, will there still be a country left by the time it declines enough?
I don't know, but I would predict, look, we're 38 shows in. I would predict, I would hope, I mean, it might sound overly confident, but a show like this will be bigger than, say, Question Time within a couple of years, because I think there's a demand for authenticity. You and I sat across for each other for an hour and a half. There's nowhere for either of us to hide. I'm exposed as, being politically naive sometimes, and you're exposed to just having to be honest with the questions. I think when you're doing 4, 6 minutes, 2 minutes on the BBC, you kind of get away with things.
But it's not just the style of the questions or getting away from things. It's the attitude of the BBC researchers and presenters that's a problem.
Sure, but that's why I say I think they're losing, because I think there's a demand for authenticity in media and a demand for authenticity in politicians. And so at the moment, I always kind of surprise people with this, but 2 of my favourite politicians at the moment, I say, are Nigel Farage and Angela Rayner. And Angela Rayner, I disagree with her on everything on policy. I completely disagree with her, but I find it kind of interesting. I think it's kind of cool she goes to Ibiza and goes dancing. I think she represents a part of the country I don't understand, the working class part, because I'm not from there. And I feel like within the realms of being stuck within the Labour Party, she's about as authentic as you get. And I think there is a demand to get more authenticity, which is why I've enjoyed...
I definitely think that's true.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying don't underestimate the power of the BBC. And I think it is a major problem. And this is one of the... So back when I first became an MP in 2010, I didn't realise what a big problem it was and what a kind of prism it presented that people see things through. And it really prevents the public hearing the truth about what's happening in the country. It's part of the problem.
So if you feel all this, is there any part of you that wants to go back and be that person?
I'm not motivated by being that person. I'm motivated by changing. The country needs to change.
Yeah.
I want to do whatever I can to help that to happen. The reason I wrote the book is to try and explain why 14 years of Conservative government had ended up where they did, which is the worst election result since 1848. I wanted to explain that, and that's why I wrote the book, because what I'm trying to say is to whoever gets elected after Keir Starmer, it's not enough just to say we're going to be different from these other people. You have to take on the most mighty vested interests. You have to take on the bureaucracy. You have to take on the swamp if you're going to change this country. And this is what I think Trump is very interesting, because in 2016, a lot of what he tried to do got sabotaged because there were people in the State Department, there were people in the Treasury in the US who did not agree with what he was trying to do, and they undermined him. So he's come in now with Project 2025 with a clear sense of, I need to change the people in this bureaucracy. I need to change the way we do things. He's brought Elon Musk in, Doge. We need that on steroids in Britain, because we're in a worse position than the US. At least their economy is in reasonable shape. I mean, Britain is not in a good way. So that's what I'm making the case for.
Is anybody echoing this to you? I mean, you don't even have to name names if they're still in government. But so I look now at Kemi and seems nice enough. But I would have thought if you're coming into power and you want to have significant change, if you want to, we would know her policies right now. She would be speaking your language loud and proud.
Lots of people are talking about these issues, and Robin Jenrick talks about them, Rupert Lowe from Reform talks about them, Nigel Farage talks about them, Kemi has talked about them. I think there is a sense, I think people in Britain are waking up to the fact that we have a failed state in this country. They're waking up to that. Previously, they've said, we've just got the most useless bunch of idle politicians in the world. Let's throw them out and get a new lot in. They're now discovering that every time they do that, things aren't getting any better. So it is a fundamental problem with the state. But I still don't think people, or how would I put this? My view of how much needs to change is probably bigger than most people's, of all those people I've just mentioned.
Because you experienced it firsthand.
I've experienced it at the top level in government. I've experienced a metaphorical gun being put to my head to not pursue a particular policy. That's what I've experienced, which has made me realise just how deep the issues are.
You've obviously received a lot of criticism from when it happened, and I think it must feel unfair that you weren't given a proper crack at it.
Yes, although I think my mum always said to me, life isn't fair. There's lots of people have terrible things happen to them in their lives, and yes, on one level I think it's unfair, but I think I've learned so much about what is wrong from that experience, which I wouldn't have done otherwise.
Well, yeah, because I mean, look, I've watched a bunch of your interviews since, and I think a common question is, if you could go back and do things differently, how would you do it differently? But you couldn't really.
No. I find that I get asked that question a lot, and it's almost because people want to believe that there is some way of fixing this thing that doesn't involve a total shake-up. They want to have the omelette, but they don't want to break the eggs. So they say, well, surely if you just presented that better, if you tweaked this policy, it would have been so much different. Well, it isn't, because in the scenario we were in, the Prime Minister and Chancellor did not hold the levers of power. The Governor of the Bank of England did. He wasn't elected. He's been completely hopeless at the job, and yet he can't be removed. That is the problem. And no amount of better PR could have changed that. I mean, the other issue, of course, which I have spoken about, is the Conservative Party itself has lost touch with what it should be about.
Well, that goes back to my point. I just don't think it's a Conservative Party anymore. It depends how. I mean, it doesn't represent what's important to me as a Conservative. I think
it's deeply split. So if you take the sort of the touchstone issues of our times, how big do you think the government should be? How do you think we should leave the ECHR and abolish the Human Rights Act and curb immigration? Do you think we should deport people who are illegal or have committed crimes? Do you believe in net zero, or do you think we should get on with fracking? Do you believe in transgender ideology, or do you believe that men are men and women are women? If you look at all those issues, I could name Conservative MPs on both sides of those issues. That's the problem. The party is fundamentally split.
I mean, you've just listed what were the key talking points of the key issues of the last US election. It's exactly the same.
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Of issues.
It's the same thing. And in the same case, in the US, there were lots of people who are known in the US as rhinos, Republicans in name only, who were on the wrong side of those arguments.
And we have sinos?
Yeah, or I call them chinos.
Chinos.
As in a cappuccino, a chino. Yeah, Conservatives in name only. That is the problem I faced. And
is that a result of the coalition?
No. Because you can see it's not, because the fact it happened in the US as well. It's happening across the Western world. And what is happening is there's a change in who is voting for Conservative parties. So it used to be the people that voted Conservative parties were rich, broadly speaking. They were established. They were part of the establishment. They were leaders in the Church of England, or, senior doctors, or civil corporate executives. Whereas, the Labour Party represented the working classes who worked in factories. Like, Britain has totally changed. America has totally changed. Now you've got a liberal elite. So the establishment are left wing. And the people who believe in conservative values, limiting immigration, using oil and gas, whatever other conservative values you want to talk about, they tend to be less well off. They tend to be more outside the system. So it's been a complete reversal. And the thing is, a lot of the established elite in the Conservative Party don't really want to admit that the establishment's left wing. And, lots of people say that, they don't want to go to a London dinner party and not be acceptable. So they go along with things like net zero or transgender rights, being supportive of migration, blah, blah, blah. So that's what's been going on. And the Republicans have seen a massive shift towards the MAGA movement. That's what basically needs to happen here.
So would you say that? So you saying the Conservative Party's left wing?
I'm saying that, the Conservative Party is definitely too left wing, and what I'm saying is it's split, and that in an ideal world we'd have a Conservatives become a Conservative Party that comprises the best bits of reform and the best bits of the Conservative Party. That's what I would like to see, because I think that is the only type of vehicle that could deliver the change the country really needs. Because in order to get the changes that I've been talking about, to really change the police, to really change the judiciary, to really change our economic policies, you need some very, very tough-minded MPs. They're going to be prepared to repeal the Equality Act, repeal the Human Rights Act, repeal the Net Zero Act, get rid of the Supreme Court, which is like a fake Supreme Court that we've got in this country. They need to be prepared to do all that stuff. That is really tough stuff. They're going to come under massive criticism from the mainstream media, the establishment, all their friends that, if they go to dinner party, they're going to, and so you're going to need 350 really tough people to do that.
But it's possible. I mean, I'm noticing in the circles that I speak to, certainly those who, a bunch of my friends, I'm from like a middle-class conservative part of Bedford, and a lot of people there either didn't vote or voted for reform or are talking about voting for reforms. They feel like reform, particularly Rupert Lowe, who you've mentioned, Richard Tice and Nigel Farage are speaking their language. But I guess you've therefore been impressed by some of what Reform have done.
Well, I mentioned individual MPs from the Conservative Party and the Reform Party, and there are lots of other unique commentators out there. We've talked about Connor Tomlinson, very
Matt
good
Goodwin,
commentator on that. But that's, of course, communications is very important. Being able to talk to people is very important. but you do actually have to have the laws that you're going to change. And you have to do it. And that's where, in the past, if you look at Conservative manifestos from the past 14 years, there's been lots of good stuff in the Conservative manifestos. Admittedly, there's some quite bad stuff as well, such as the 0.7 of international aid, which policy I never supported. But you
should explain what that is then.
Well, this is that we have to spend 0.7 of our GDP on international aid, which the Conservative Party put into law, which I think has largely been misspent. So it's not good enough just to write something good in the manifesto.
It's very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin.
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with Casa.
Right. So, could you see a scenario where there is a meeting of the minds between Reform and Conservatives then?
Potentially, but what I think is more absolutely necessary is a popular movement to push politicians in the right direction. It's got to come from the grassroots. That's the Trump lesson. It started with the Tea Party. You had the MAGA movement actually putting pressure on politicians to do the right thing. Whereas the way things have worked in Britain, and I saw this particularly in 2022, is the mainstream media and the left create a hoo-ha on social media, which then influences the public. We need it to be the other way around, that the public need to actually be pushing the agenda.
I think that's starting to happen.
Well, you keep saying this. I'm very pleased to hear this. I'm not as optimistic as you, having seen from the inside just how powerful those forces are.
Well, look, I am fearful of what you've told me from the inside. I'm saying from the outside, I think we're starting to see it. And I think there's a lot of strong signals. I mean, look, I see the comments on our YouTube and what people are saying. I see the riots that we had following the Southall murders. I see what's happening with Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson's a really interesting character because I obviously spent not obviously, but I'm probably one of many people who spent the last few years just ignoring him, thinking he was just some racist thug. And the Overton window certainly shifted on him. But what I hadn't really fully appreciated is the working class people that he represents, who feel like they've been left behind, who feel like they've been ignored. And it's made me have to really kind of question my own thoughts on Tommy. I can't ignore he has committed crimes and he has been convicted of assault and mortgage fraud and contempt of court. But at the same time, despite all those things, there are a number of people who are very supportive of him. It's similar to Trump. Trump doesn't have a very clean, clear past, but still has a number of people that support him because he's speaking the same language. And it's become a really kind of... I think Tommy's become a really challenging person for many people, challenging for Reform as well, because they've been questioned on him. And then it's made me question, has he been politically targeted? I've tried to compare his treatment to other people who've committed similar crimes. It seems like his punishments have been harsher. The speed to which he was convicted, same day conviction, I think, or next day conviction. I found him this a really challenging...
There's no doubt that when you look at the justice system and who is being prosecuted for what, there seemed to be some massively different treatment meted out. And the Grooming Gangs is the case in point about the level of punishment they've received.
But are you kind of agreeing with that, saying Tommy has been targeted?
Well, it's certainly, I mean, the fact he's in solitary, I don't know the details of the case. The fact he's in solitary confinement. What I would say is that it is clear that the justice system is not treating people equally as it should.
I mean, he has been previously attacked in prison, so there is part of you can go, okay, perhaps it is for his own safety because he was previously attacked. But at the same time, 18 months in solitary seems a long time. We did the same to Julian Assange. I know Julian's family well. I've interviewed his wife, brother, and dad, and they've all talked about the impact it had on him, which was devastating. So does the government have the ability to use the judiciary to target people unfairly?
I don't think that's the problem, although I am generally critical of Keir Starmer. I think the problem is the judiciary aren't accountable. And the justice system isn't accountable. That's what I think the problem is. I think that the way that elements of the justice system behave is not treating people equally. I think we also have a legal problem, and the way things like the Equality Act are interpreted, the Human Rights Act are interpreted, is a big problem, and both of those acts should go as well. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, because is the problem the legislation, or is the problem the lack of accountability in the system? I think both of them are probably problems, and both of them have to be fixed. And just back to your point about the working class people in Britain and how people have been let down. And I think people have been hugely let down. I think the Grooming Gangs scandal is one element of that. But if you look at the economic system and the way that has been run, it has not been run in the interests of people who live in the north of England, of people who live in small towns and villages. It has not been run in their interests. And I spent 2 years as Chief Secretary to the Treasury looking at how they do their economic models. And it is very centric to London, is very centric to the way that the liberal elite look at the world, because those are the people in the Treasury system. And those are the people working at the Bank of England. So there's no doubt in my mind that people are absolutely right to be angry about where we've ended up. I would like to see more of an organised movement like the MAGA movement in the US. That where people aren't just talking about the personalities, they're also talking about what needs to change about our country. And we're starting to talk about that now. Because it's easy to, I can point lots of fingers at lots of people, but, the last time Keir Starmer can go for an election is 2029. By 2029, what would the British public demand that changes about our country to actually start fixing it? That's what is the what that's really important.
Well, it goes back to my point. Sometimes I think it has to get really bad for you to realise. Like
But people need to be thinking about the what. They need to be thinking about what needs to change. It can't just be we need X person rather than Y person. It's going to be what needs to change.
But sometimes it has to come from real pain. Like, so I've been traveling and making documentaries for the last few years as well. I went out to El Salvador post Bukele, and I've been 4 times, and I've witnessed the change in that country from when just after he got elected to where he is now. This country has gone from having I think it was the highest or the second highest murder rate in the world, to having now the lowest murder rate in the Western Hemisphere. He's completely changed the economy there. He's taken on the IMF. I've been out to Argentina. I've seen what's happened with Malay. I'm aware of what's happening in America. These are hard shifts that people have demanded. Yeah. But from those 2 countries, they had to go through a lot of pain to get there. Yeah. And it's just...
I only wish we hadn't in Britain. This is my... you asked me, did I think it was unfair or do I have regrets? I mean, what really frustrates me is it was obvious the way things were heading in 2022, but there was a massive reluctance to change anything on the part of partly Conservative MPs, but also on the part of the system overall. And it's just incredibly sad that it has to get so much worse for things to change.
I've got a few things here. So, a national debt at depends where you go, ranging from 2.8 trillion to over 3 trillion, around 110% of GDP. Tax as a percentage of GDP is, I think you said in your book 46%?
That's spending.
Spending,
Tax
okay.
is lower than that, but
Yeah.
tax will eventually have to catch up with that.
Or 37.7%, and it's been trending upwards, whilst the value of our pound has been decreasing. UK government debt to reach 310% of GDP by the 2070s. I mean, I think that's, here's the national debt.
Yeah.
This is the one that always gets me. The interest on our debt alone, 110 billion a year, is nearly 30 billion more than we spend on education. GDP growth estimates vary from 1.2 to 1.7%. Like, every single measure is going in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Every single measure. The reason I've gone down this rabbit hole, it might not be anything you know anything about, but previous to this, I don't know if you know, this show for 7 years was a show about Bitcoin. It was the biggest show about Bitcoin. That's what we covered, and we decided to move back to the UK and cover politics. But I've been down all these different rabbit holes trying to understand the history of sound money being on the gold standard, why people care about Bitcoin, why things go up in value, down in value. And I've come to the conclusion that a sound economic basis is what any government needs.
Yeah.
And
Sound money.
Sound money, yeah. I mean, I don't know if we could or would return to a sound money standard.
I think we definitely need to return to an accountable Bank of England. So,
do we need a central bank?
That's an interesting question. Well, if we do have one, it ought to be accountable. So at the moment, we've got the worst of all worlds. We've got an unaccountable central bank. So what Gordon Brown did in making it independent, and you can see the results. We've had huge levels of inflation. We had QE that went on for far too long. Asset price spikes, essentially supporting very, very lax government spending policies with printing money.
Yeah.
That's what's going on. And the result was inflation. And we were told beforehand that it was going to be transitory. And it wasn't transitory, even though the lessons had all been learnt before. And nobody has been held accountable for that, even though it's created massive pain for British people. So, I mean, I am a supporter of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. I think they're a good thing. I think they help take power away from central banks. So in that respect, they're a good thing. I'm very, very worried about anything like a central bank digital currency.
I completely
which will,
agree.
I think, give the state huge amounts of power. And what we know is overweening state power is not a good thing. Could we move to a world free of central banks? It's a beautiful idea.
The free market for money.
A beautiful idea. You've obviously had Steve Baker on your show.
Well, I've covered this prior to Steve. So my friend Nick wrote an article called. He wrote two. Can you look up?
Nick Carter.
Yeah, Nick Carter's article. He wrote an article called "Bitcoin: A Peaceful Revolution," which was brilliant. But he wrote an article about the history of the free market for money, and he kind of spiked my interest in an idea that we would be better accepting volatility, accepting bank failures, and having a free market for money. And then I realized, actually, I'm already operating a free market for money because I keep 99% of my money in Bitcoin anyway. And that is a free market for money. A
most peaceful revolution.
A most peaceful revolution. Yeah, very interesting
I
argument.
certainly think that the monetary policy and the whole monetary system needs to be re-examined and thought about. And the problem in Britain is it became a taboo subject. When I was at the Treasury and tried to ask about monetary policy, I was told it wasn't our responsibility. It was the responsibility of the Bank of England. And I said, well, the Chancellor's there to set the terms the Bank of England operates on. The Chancellor's the politician, not the Governor of the Bank of England. The Chancellor should have a view on monetary policy. And during the leadership campaign in 2022, where I flagged up all the policies I was going to pursue, I said that we should look again at the Bank of England's mandate. And again, I was accused of attacking the Bank of England's independence. So they weren't interested in what the actual monetary policy was. They were interested in my attack on the Bank of England's independence. And whenever an organisation justifies itself by saying it's independent, that, in my view, is a red flag that there is a problem. So all of this should be talked about. The international monetary system, the independence of central banks, the role of cryptocurrencies, I think all of those things. Under the surface of what's gone wrong over the past 30 years, monetary policy is very important, but we haven't talked about it.
Can I tell you about a couple of things that I've experienced that I've gone through, which seem ludicrous? I'd love your perspective on. I was a Lloyds Bank customer for 25 years, and I got a phone call one day from a call centre. Somebody worked in there, I had no idea, sounded about 25 years old, asking me about a couple of my transactions. I said, which ones? And they brought up two where I transferred money to a Bitcoin exchange. And I said, am I under investigation? They said, no, we just want to know why you're transferring this money. I said, well, I'm a grown adult. I've got 2 kids and run 4 businesses. It's none of your business. 3 days later, they closed down my bank account. I got a letter. 2 weeks later, 3 days later, I got a letter, closed down my bank account. I then moved to another bank, a neobank. They closed down my bank account because my podcast was about Bitcoin. And I got a payment from a company, a sponsor, which is a Bitcoin company. They closed down my bank account. So I'm now with Revolut, and Revolut works very well for me. But so many people I know have either had bank accounts closed or they've had restrictions put on them to even purchase Bitcoin, which they see as an escape. And now we're in this ludicrous place where you have to be a high net worth investor now to buy Bitcoin. Yet I can download infinite gambling apps on my phone and bet on the price of ping pong or the next point in tennis. And it feels like the banking system has become part of the surveillance state.
They don't want to lose control. But
it also feels like part of the surveillance state as well.
Well, yes, and as the politically exposed person rule, you remember the whole Nigel Farage bank account incident. I've struggled to get bank accounts and things like that for that reason.
You have as well.
Yeah. It's very, very difficult for politicians to operate. But for that reason.
But you're the guy you're the guys and sorry, I say guys.
But you're still subject. You're still subject to all these rules. And I mean, I think all of this in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, there was a lot of extra bureaucracy created. It hasn't actually helped customers. It's just made the whole system bureaucratic and, as you say, increased levels of interference.
Well, even if you're taking money out as cash these days, if you want to take out a couple of £1,000 at a branch, you get interrogated on your own money, Liz. And I don't understand how the banking system now has been weaponized against the productive parts of society. Surely we should be helping and supporting the productive parts of society.
But this comes from, it always starts with, we want to protect people from, making bad investment decisions, or we want to give them a chance to think about what they've done, or, we want to make sure that, a lot of the politically exposed person came in through anti-money laundering legislation. And then there is a mission creep. And essentially, when I was saying about unelected state bureaucrats having unaccountable power, well, when the state regulates industries, it also means those people have unaccountable power because you're giving them unaccountable power by proxy. And this is exactly what happened with the post office scandal. Mm-hmm. Do you remember the post office were given the power to prosecute people? And the minute you give people unaccountable power, it always gets misused by bad people who want to cover things up or people with ideological motives. It always gets misused. So we have to be very careful about where state power gets used.
So how should we change the economic foundation or the economic policies of our country? What is required to make us a more prosperous country, to drive growth? Because I'm pretty sure there's nothing Labour's going to do over the next 5 years that will drive meaningful growth.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, all they're going to do is make everything worse.
Yes.
From a bad position.
Well, I can say that as a business owner.
What do we need to do? We need to abandon net zero and repeal the Climate Change Act. We need to get fracking. That was one of the things that drove the American energy revolution, was fracking. Cheap energy made it much easier to manufacture, much easier to run a business. We know there's going to be lots of businesses like AI that require high levels of energy. We need to get fracking, abandon net zero. We need to abolish...
stops that? Let's just deal with each one at a time then.
Oh my God, there's a very long list.
Yeah, I know, but okay, cool. So what stops us abandoning net zero?
Well, you've got a government that are ideologically committed, and Ed Miliband put in this piece of legislation in 2008, the Climate Change Act. They're ideologically committed. They are believers in Greta Thunberg. They're friends with the people that stick themselves to the road. They say we've got a government that's ideologically opposed, but I think ideologically opposed to what I'm saying. But I also think we need the public to speak up more. I mean, we have the highest energy bills in the developed world. Maybe if there were more protests, or the farmers came out and protested about inheritance tax, but where are the householders saying we're not putting up with this anymore? We've got the highest energy bills in the world. We don't actually want to pursue a suicidal net zero policy when nobody else is doing it, which they're not. This is all about political will, but in Westminster, there's a panoply of vested interests constantly lobbying. The green energy companies are there lobbying for more subsidies. Dale
Vince.
You've got Dale Vince, you've got the
Big
sort of
Labour
swampy types, the Just Stop Oil blocking the roads, etc. And there needs to be a countervailing force, which is what I'm talking about, political movements. There needs to be a countervailing force saying, we're not going to put up with these high energy prices anymore. Businesses need to talk about this. I mean, businesses have only started, or big business in particular, complaining after the budget. Even though the Labour Party spent the entire election campaign saying we're going to put in all these nutty net zero policies, they pretty much admitted they were going to raise tax. But there were a lot of businesses that were quite quiet and have only started complaining now.
Check Sky News. I think some retailer just came out today, said they're closing more stores because of the budget.
Why weren't they? Where were they 3, 4, 5 years ago? Anyway, the other things we need to do, Town and Country Planning Act 1947, probably the most damaging piece of legislation in British history, needs to be repealed.
Don't know anything about it.
So this was under the Clement Attlee government, and essentially it nationalised land and made it much harder to build houses. So in the 1930s, and you can see this, all the semis that have been built around cities like Leeds or London or wherever, they were all built in the 1930s before the Town and Country Planning Act. We were building 300,000 homes a year.
Mm-hmm.
Labour can't manage that now. But in 1947, the Attlee government put in the Town and Country Planning Act, put in the huge green belts around cities, some of which aren't green. It's one thing I agree with Keir Starmer on. There is a grey belt. But also just made it incredibly cumbersome to build houses. That you have to get permission from the local council to do what you want on your own land. Until we get rid of that, I think it is very difficult for things to get built in this country.
Should government be building houses?
No. These houses in the 30s were being built entirely by the private sector. 300,000 houses a year. And it was all ruined by the Attlee government.
Okay.
So those are two things that I do.
Yeah.
Massively cut the size of government. I'm a Javier Milei fan.
You're a libertarian. You're a libertarian conservative.
I think somebody said that a conservative is a libertarian with daughters, and I have 2 daughters. So
I have one. Yeah, I could agree with that one.
So it ought to. I mean, these words like libertarian or conservative, it all depends how you interpret them.
At Ledden, we built the best Bitcoin-backed loan platform in the world. Proven, trusted, growing. Ledden's proven track record speaks for itself. Visit ledden.io/Mr. Obnoxious to get started. Ledden, there is no second best. Ledden is not regulated in the United Kingdom. Any credit products or virtual asset services provided by Ledden are not subject to UK regulatory protections. Please consider the risks associated with virtual assets and consult a financial advisor before making any decisions.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with massively reducing the size of government because I'm seeing my taxes go up year after year after year.
But also it actually stops growth because you're you're taking away people who could be doing productive things and you're putting them in Whitehall.
Yes.
Or they're working from home and pretending to be in Whitehall. So you are taking productive people out of the system.
Well, but you're also taking money from productive people to give to government to distribute to underproductive people.
Correct.
And again, I say I know that somebody has multiple businesses. I keep talking about this. I honestly feel less inclined to start new businesses these days because it's just like, what's the point? The hurdle rate to get to the point where you actually get to a dividend is so high now. It's not.
You're preaching to the converted.
Yeah. So where do you stand? I had George Galloway in here the other day, and even as a conservative,
I don't agree with him on very much.
No, but I respect he stands up for what he believes in, and he doesn't toe any kind of party line. But one area I did have an interesting conversation with him about, as somebody who disagrees with most of left-wing politics, is that I'm troubled by some of the privatization. Like I'm troubled by what's happened to the water industry. That part of privatization, where I had somebody in, we'd made a show about it, how private equity is essentially siphoned out and laid all of these companies now with huge amount of debt. It's led to a lack of investments and pollution in our rivers.
It's been very badly regulated.
So you put that down to regulation?
Yes.
So yes. It could be privatized, but so how would you change the regulation for that?
So first of all, you've got a proliferation of regulators. So you've got Ofgem, Ofwat, all these different regulators regulating the same things, which are basically utilities. I would have a single regulator covering all the industries. And if somebody is providing a utility like water, and there are some, if you had a single regulator, you could actually have telecoms companies or electricity companies running, using the same basic infrastructure that is all network infrastructure, so it'd be more efficient. But if you're providing a utility, I don't think the government is particularly good at running organisations or operations. I think
we can all agree on that.
And actually, what the story of the railway industry over the last 30 years is more and more of it is effectively run by the government. Say civil servants at the Department of Transport are deciding the train timetable, whatever. They shouldn't be doing that. But if it's a business where you are just providing a utility, it should be regulated on a cost plus basis or something like that, so that the infrastructure is being properly priced. It's really the sort of government it's like a spider's web of laws that it's almost impossible to get to the bottom of which law is creating all the problems. So do you remember on HS2 there was the massive bat tunnel that cost 100 million? But that is because of the Natural Habitats Directive, which is a piece of European legislation we didn't get off the statute books. So if you actually got rid of all that stuff, like the Natural Habitats Directive, like the nutrient neutrality rules, then you could actually properly monitor the water companies on where they're delivering the infrastructure in a cost-efficient way. At the moment, that's impossible because there's just so much bureaucracy on top of it. You're like swimming in the bureaucracy. But the idea, before these utilities were privatised, it took 6 months to get a phone line. The state was not good at doing this stuff. I remember British Rail when I was a child. It was rubbish. All the trains were late. They were dirty. They
still are, aren't they?
They're still...
They are from Bedford.
They're better. Well,
they've got worse.
No, but they got better.
Yeah.
And now they're getting worse because there's more and more state involvement in them.
Right.
Now, I don't think we could go into a long discussion about it. I don't think they were privatised in the right way.
Right.
I think you should have privatised the train and the track together. Go back to the days of Great Western Railways and, those great sort of companies that actually controlled the track and train, ran the service. That's what we ought to have done. Separating the track and train was a mistake.
So sorry, you said the government isn't very good at running things. What is government actually good at? Or is it that government's a necessary evil and it should do the best it can.
Government is necessary.
It's just necessary.
So, for example...
Or natural monopoly.
So, defence.
Yes.
Keeping our country safe. Police. Keeping our streets safe. Making sure that everybody in society has the means of, getting a good education. That doesn't mean the government has to provide schools. It just means that everybody should have a means of getting a good education. But I think there's been massive mission creep in what the state does, and it's been a disaster. I don't think the state should be investing in the arts, for example. What business is it of the government about whether a museum's good or bad?
It's quite nice that some are kept free.
And I'm afraid we're going to disagree on this point.
Yeah, it's just...
I really resent going abroad and paying to get into museums and then seeing tourists from overseas getting free into our museum. I think that's completely wrong.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. I just think, a lot of people don't even get to travel abroad. I remember when my kids were young, we would come down to London and go to the Victoria and Albert and Tate Modern, and I think we went more often because of the fact they were free. Look, I can understand the arguments against
but
it.
People who never go to those places are paying to subsidise your visit.
Yeah, I mean...
people with less money than you that couldn't even afford to go to London are basically subsidising your visit to the V&A.
No, and I agree, because I've made the exact same argument.
So you like free things, basically?
No.
What a surprise. And I'm afraid that the country is in the condition we're in because a lot of people like free things.
Because of me wanting free. Well, no, but I've made the exact same arguments against maternity leave, that people who choose not to have children should be paying for people who choose to have children. And I've made the exact same argument. Don't worry, I've had the same faces back at me. Yeah. I've made the exact same argument.
With that. Because I think children are a benefit to society.
Well, but you want them to be, people to freely have them without having to, I want to have to pay for you if you want to have children. It's the same argument, Liz.
Well, as a society, I think it's good if people in Britain are having children, because that will mean that we're a successful country in the future. I
think it's good if we have
and the
free
tax
arts.
system is not neutral. The tax system isn't neutral.
I know. Look, I understand the point you're making. I don't think we've done a particularly good. I don't think the police. I think the police have been under a lot of criticism for the entirety of since I was Connor's age, like 20s. I don't know if they're actually doing a good job, or they only get spoken about when there is a scandal. And that's an area I've struggled with. Defence, I don't really know how defence works for us, because I've never lived at a time where we've been attacked. So these aren't things. These are things that are nebulous to me.
But these are the things the state has to do.
Yeah. No,
they're things the state has to do. And we've talked, I think improving accountability in all of these organisations will massively improve their performance.
What about the health service?
Goodness me.
Well, I can give you my opinion first.
Go on then.
So I have private healthcare because I think it's amazingly cheap in this country. It costs for me and the kids less than £300 a month, whereas I know what people pay in the US, which is ridiculous amounts. I had a back operation. I was in surgery 3 days after the diagnosis. My son has shin splints, dealt with very well. I think it's great that we have the NHS. I think it's bloated. I think there's too much middle management. But I think what we should do is incentivize more people to be private. I think private healthcare should lead to a tax break, similar to private education, rather than punishing people for taking these. That's where I am. I think a fully privatized healthcare system, we've seen what happens in the US, I don't think it's good.
But that isn't the choice. And this is often presented as you either have to have the NHS or the American healthcare system.
No, I'm offering the middle ground, the Australian system, where it's one.
I think the Japanese system is pretty good, which is a social insurance system. I think some of the European systems are quite good. But I don't think I think the National Health Service does have to change. It really does.
Is that stuck being unable to be changed for the same reasons?
I think there are accountability problems, but I think the not having a social insurance system with universal cover is a problem. And I think we should look at where it works best, where where people are best cared for and use their systems.
I know you go out to the US a lot. I go out to the US a lot. Do you think we need more?
I don't get ill when I'm there.
You don't get ill when you're there?
Touch wood.
Actually, have I been ill on that? I've been to hospital there. Do you think we need more of a culture of freedom and liberty in this country?
Yes. God, yes. Definitely.
Do you think
I'd love the First Amendment. I don't want a written constitution. I just want the First Amendment.
Okay. Would you want the Second Amendment? I don't. It's all my American friends are like, well, you need the Second Amendment to protect the First Amendment. I don't think we have the right culture here. But how do you have a First Amendment without a constitution? Why don't you want to have a constitution?
Well, we do have a constitution in that we have, Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, all of those great pieces of law that shape the liberties we have. And I think the liberties that were there already, such as free speech, which is in the Bill of Rights, these things have actually been curtailed by more recent pieces of legislation like the Human Rights Act. So I think getting rid of all of this detritus that have been giving people false rights, if you like, why should a rapist have a right to a family life in Britain? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So I think if we get rid of that, those false rights, we will return to our traditional British liberties.
So we should.
But I fear if we ended up with a written constitution, it would be subject to huge judicial interpretation. And I want Parliament to be in charge of this country. I don't want the judiciary to be in charge of this country.
Okay, I agree. But I don't think we have free speech in the country right now.
I agree with that.
I don't think we
Definitely.
have a free media. I think journalists are concerned about writing particular articles, especially independent journalists. I've been through a 5-year libel lawsuit recently for tweets. Mm-hmm. And I know there are people right now who are currently in jail for writing things on Twitter. I don't think we have a culture of freedom and liberty. I don't think we have a culture of free speech in this country.
I agree. But we have to look at why we've ended up there. And we've ended up there because of various communications acts that have limited free speech, the online, I think it's the Online Speech Act, the Human Rights
Safety Act?
Yeah, the Online Safety Act, the Equality Act. All of these pieces of legislation have essentially made it harder for people to be free in this country, even though they've got nice names like human rights and equality. So you think this is great stuff, or online safety. Who could be against that? They've had the effect of damaging our traditional liberties. And this is the difference, I think, in Britain. Our whole culture is based on the idea that people are free to do something provided it isn't prohibited, whereas other countries have this approach of positive rights. We've never had that culture of positive rights, and Tony Blair in particular tried to insert that into our culture, and it has not worked. So we've got to get rid of all that stuff.
Where do you think our place is in the world now? Because I feel
somewhere near Europe. It's just off the coast of France.
We're a small nation with a rich history. My American friends are always taking the piss out of me, saying, "Look, you're a small, irrelevant nation now." And
I like to think we invented them, basically.
Well, we did. We did. I like to say
they get offended if I say that. I say obviously there was a bit of development after that.
Well, the thing you can mock them for is you got rid of us for a 2% T tax and now pay 61% tax in California. So did you really get freedom? But they do question our place in the world. I think there's a.
I think we should stop worrying about this stuff.
Well, I don't.
I really think we should stop worrying, and we should start worrying about how to make our country successful again. That's what we should worry about. That's what people in Britain care about.
But I think it's the same thing. I think if we make it,
I think making our country successful again is what people want to see. I think that's quite. So I don't think we should spend time like a sort of teenage girl at a party worried about what other people think of us. We should instead be focusing on improving ourselves.
Well, but I think I'm making the same point. I think the point there is this kind of reflection on us. Yeah, they maybe only see the headlines, but what are they seeing at the moment? They're seeing a faltering economy, high tax, socialist, left-wing government, rape gangs. They're seeing migrant crisis, mass immigration, and they're looking at us thinking, oh, Britain's fallen.
But the thing, thank God for X, because it's exposing all of the problems in this country and people are able to speak freely on it. And actually Americans are able to speak freely on X because they can't be prosecuted under any of the bonkers laws that we have in this country. So I say good on them for exposing what the problems are, because the sooner we acknowledge what the problems are of this country, the sooner we can get on with sorting them out.
Well, there's a huge amount of problems. Everything we've spoken about, you spoke about, comes back to this swamp. Everything comes back to needing a hard shift. You're a fan of Millet. I'm a Millet. I'm a fan of Bukele. May become a fan of Trump if he does something in the next 4 years. I would say, how do you appeal then to the people on the left who think they're voting for good, but they don't really understand they're voting for things that work against their own best interests?
Well, I think they're rapidly finding out what a Labour government looks like. And some of the people on the left are voting in their best interests. If you're a train driver, you've done pretty well out of this Labour government.
Sure.
If you're a public sector worker who gets to work from home 4 days a week or whatever, you're doing pretty well out of this Labour government. It's the people who voted Labour because they wanted to change. Those are the people who, I think Keir Starmer is doing the job of explaining what the problems are with that approach.
Do you think he survives the year?
I do think he will. I know there's a lot of doom and gloom, but he's got a huge parliamentary majority. And this is the difference. We've just been talking about Argentina and the US. I do not understand. I do not know any details about El Salvador and the system there. But the point is, they have a presidential system. So once a president gets elected, they can't really be removed. Whereas we have a parliamentary system. So this is my point about, it's not just the identity of the leader that's important. It's having 350 MPs with iron wills. You don't just need, you need people who are prepared to vote the tough stuff through Parliament that people won't necessarily like. There'll be all sorts of whinging about getting rid of human rights or getting rid of net zero or abolishing the Town and Country Planning Act. There'll be all sorts of whinging about that. You need a group of tough people. I think that is what's different about the British system.
But how do we get back there again? Because it feels like we're a long way from finding that person.
It's
not
sure
the person.
I've just said it's the people. You've just said you need 350 of these people. You do.
Yeah, but...
And you also you don't just need 350 of the people. You need the people in the country who are going to support that. And who are going to get on the streets and protest about how high their electricity bills are. And start making noise. That's
where I come back. I still think we're such a long way from that.
Okay, well.
Yeah. All right, final thoughts. You said there's 10 years to save the West. How many years? Was that a year ago?
I did it. No, this is 2024. So the West has to be saved by 2034.
2034, okay.
It's going quite well so far in that Donald Trump got elected. So that was a big step forward.
And so I think you're hoping he delivers on the promise.
Yes.
Because if he fails, and if he doesn't reduce the size of the state, and if he doesn't reduce the size of the debt, it meant nothing.
Well, he's already, I think, having a positive effect on things like the woke agenda. Mm-hmm. Has markedly lost a head of steam, I think, since he was elected. And the net zero agenda, people are talking less about that. So, yes, he has to deal with issues like America's debt, but he also has to change the regulatory culture and the wokery that had been coming out of the US and having a bad influence here as well.
So what's your rallying cry then, Liz? Get out there and protest.
My rallying cry is that we need a big bazooka to change Britain, that it's not going to be enough just to elect a good leader, that there have to be, we need great MPs, we need people to run the bureaucracy who believe in changing our country, and we need huge amounts of public support. And people have to understand what needs to happen.
And if someone came along with that bazooka, could you be tempted back in?
I'm always willing to fire a bazooka.
Liz, thank you. I appreciate your time, being very generous. Thanks to everyone listening.
Thank you.
Bye.